Welcome back to Worldview. Now, last week, the Reverend Dr. Britt Minchell joined us to discuss some of the issues surrounding this week's end of the papacy of Benedict XVI. Yesterday, the Vatican went to great lengths to ensure we knew how to address His Holiness after retirement, and that he would soon trade in his trademark red Prada shoes for brown ones, but there was still no further word on the infighting to determine his successor. Too, we saw the recent resignation of UK's Cardinal, and Benedict saying that he would leave addressing further charges of abuse to his successor. That left many feeling unfulfilled, to say the least. And frankly, as the scandal continues to unfold, it is the victims of priest abuse who continue to get short shrift. Well, here at Worldview, we wanted to change a bit of that. Joining me on the program today is Janet Heimlich. She's an award-winning journalist and the author of a new book, Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Child Maltreatment. It's the first book to take an in-depth look at religiously motivated child abuse and neglect in the United States. Now, for 8 years, Janet was a freelance reporter for National Public Radio. Her work won 9 journalism awards, including the Regional Katie, the Houston Press Club's Radio Journalist of the Year, and the Texas Bar Association's Gavel Award. Ms. Heimlich has written many nonfiction articles for such publications as Texas Monthly, the Texas Observer, and the Austin American Statesman. She has a BA in Communications from Stanford University. Janet Heimlich, welcome to Worldview.
Thank you so much for having me, Dennis.
Janet, I had a chance to briefly read some of your book last night, and there's one term in particular that jumped out at me: religious child maltreatment. And you contend that this is something that goes beyond the sexual abuse cases we read so much about. Please tell us and our audience what the various manifestations of religious child maltreatment are and how we as lay people might recognize these symptoms.
Sure. Well, the reason that I first got interested in this topic was really the way that most people are. They read a high-profile case going on in the media, and we're just shocked by some of these things. I think that the two most flagrant types of crimes that drew my attention initially were religious medical neglect cases, where children who have serious illnesses are not provided any medical care due to the faith-healing type beliefs of their family, their parents, or their religious community. And so we've seen children around the world dying of treatable illnesses because of the belief system of those around them. The other really kind of explosive types of cases include the sexual abuse that you mentioned in your introduction, where you have widespread child sexual abuse that is not just happening in some of these authoritarian type religious environments, but no one's doing much about it. And certainly it's very highly frowned upon to call the police. But beyond that, some of the cases we don't hear so much about would include the emotional issues. Fear-based religious doctrines are very difficult on children. It's not easy on a child to be raised by a parent that's very fearful, and it can also lead to a lot of psychological harm for the children, and there are other issues as well.
It also has something to do with this whole issue of control. And, as I mentioned in my email, I was a victim of some of this abuse as well at a non-Catholic church. And I can see how pervasive this maltreatment was during my own youth. But I know your research was largely focused on the U.S. What happens when, for example, you have state religions? I mean, essentially, throughout much of the Muslim world, I mean, even in Ireland and Italy, where the Catholic Church crosses over from theology to theocracy, and families want their children to grow up to be priests. It's hard to tell where the theology ends and governing actually begins in these cases. What happens there?
Yeah, I think it is a real problem. In fact, this morning as I was driving, someone had a bumper sticker on their car that said, "Give me democracy, not theocracy." And I think what's important to understand is even in some of these underdeveloped countries where the theology of the very powerful can really take over, and you see just extreme cases of religious child maltreatment. I mean, examples would include what the Taliban is doing to try to infringe on girls' rights to an education. You have extreme, I'm going to call it corporal punishment, but extreme physical abuse and murders of women and men in some of those cultures because they're simply not complying with the rules of the culture. But it's important to understand that even in your culture and in mine, we see examples of this because we kind of see little theocracies spread about, whether it's a household or a place of worship or a religious community.
How powerful
and
is
you
this?
mentioned control. Excuse me if I could add, failed to mention something I thought was important regarding control, the need to control children. It often manifests itself in the form of extreme corporal punishment, and that you'll see manifesting itself in many different religious environments, but in terms of Christian cultures, and this would be in the most conservative aspects of those cultures, the idea is that children are born sinful, and therefore we're sort of doing them a favor to try to rid them of sin by, beating the devil out of them, so to speak.
Yeah, and I've seen even in one of the issues that came up during the last election cycle in the United States was the Mormonism of Mitt Romney being a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, and some of the rather extreme positions that church has taken and regarding child labor and things of that sort. It just seems as though when you have an organization like a church that has such strong emotional control, which then moves into an area of abuse, where's the line for people, and how does one see how this actually manifests?
Well, it's very difficult to get inside that culture if you're an outsider. And we see that happen not only in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, due to the fact that that church is so powerful, not just in the state of Utah where it's headquartered, but outside of that area. So, for example, you'll have lots of legislation that really favors that church. I'll give you another example that's kind of similar. The Christian Science Church has had, at one time, had a lot of power in this country, and they actually were able to get just about every state to pass legislation. It's a very pro-faith healing church. Passed legislation that essentially allowed many parents to escape prosecution if their children died from religious medical neglect. Now, back to the LDS Church, you have these offshoots, these sects of groups, fundamentalist Mormons that are polygamous. Not all of them will practice underage marriage, but a number of them do. And with those kinds of situations, they don't have a whole lot of power outside of themselves, but they are so isolated and so orchestrated to keep outsiders out that there's still a difficulty in penetration there. So you see how it sort of works both against children if there's religious child abuse going on, both in the very small isolated sects as well as the very large powerful ones.
Yeah, and it's rather ironic. Our guest last week, Dr. Minchell, wrote his thesis at Boston University Divinity School on the issue of the church as the center of the community, the center of the city, how European churches were built virtually as fortresses in the middle of town, that nothing could get past them. And yet you still see, whether it's in Christianity or in any other religion, the temple, the mosque, the building itself being impenetrable by those from the outside. And it makes it very difficult for one, I would think, to get into issues such as this level of abuse. I can remember, as a young child, that the priest was God's representative here on earth, so you had to listen and do everything that they said at that particular point in time. How much of that came through in your study and in your work?
A great deal. In terms of building fortresses, when that happens as a way to protect those on the inside from persecution, of course that's of great value. But unfortunately, it's also used to prevent outsiders from finding out about naughty secrets going on inside. So we see that in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities, Jehovah's Witnesses, just really across the board. You were just talking about these doctrines that where congregants are led to believe that their religious leaders have some sort of godly property to their being. that's incredibly damaging in cases of child sexual abuse because, regardless of the religion, if those kinds of beliefs are held and religious leaders are not questioned and certainly not held accountable, if they do something wrong, whether it's, stealing from the place of worship or doing other things, people are not going to, A, believe a child if he or she complains of having been abused, perhaps might even punish the child for raising such a thing, let alone going to the police. And you have religious leaders across the board, including the I was going to say the current Pope, I guess I should say almost the former Pope at this time.
Yeah, another 24 hours to go.
As well as leaders in the Jewish community.
Yeah.
Right. As well as leaders in the, some rabbinical councils that very much frown upon reporting sexual abuse or other forms of abuse to the outside.
It's stunning to me, the level of hypocrisy. I mean, if you look even within the, the Christian evangelical community in your country, you see, a very strong anti-gay doctrine, yet many of them are later found to be acting upon and behaving on, repressed gay feelings of their own, and it just seems so stunning that there's such a vocal outcry, yet nothing seems to penetrate. I mean, this is a fascinating subject, Janet, and one I'm sure we're going to come back to. Tell us a little bit about your book tour coming up.
Well, I'm very excited, leaving just in a few days to head to England, where I'll be speaking in London and outlying areas about the subject of religious child maltreatment. If you go to my website, which is religiouschildmaltreatment.com, you can see my event calendar, and I'll be speaking at about 11 different venues there.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm sorry, 12 minutes is just not enough for us to really dive into this. When we launch our Bookview program and we have a full hour to talk to an author, we're going to have to come back and chat with you some more. I want to thank you for joining us here on Worldview.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
We've been speaking with journalist and author Janet Heimlich about her new book, Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Maltreatment. You can find out more about the book and Janet's upcoming speaking tour on the website www.religiouschildmaltreatment.com. That's one word. And we'll be back with a look at a man who's being threatened with a $25 million lawsuit for his very public campaign to dump Trump. Has the Donald lost his sense of humor? Stay right here. You're watching Worldview with Denis Campbell.